Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert, two titans of cinematic review. Sometimes right, sometimes wrong, but always captivating. Your hosts Antonio of the Cult-Worthy Cinema Podcast and Justin Henson of the Movie Wire are here to take you back to the balcony. Okay, Justin Henson of the Movie Wire. This is one of our special episodes where we are going off the beaten path, and we're going to try something new with our Siskel and Ebert experiment. So we were going to do a listener request from our good friend Josh Scar of Talking Smack. He wanted us to cover Captain Ron. Captain Ron is a guilty pleasure of mine. I own it. However, Siskel and Ebert did not cover Captain Ron on their show, which surprises me because they covered a lot of Drek in their time, and they didn't even bother to cover that one. So we had to get creative. And I threw out the idea that we could do a Siskel and Ebert quiz show where I will play clips of Siskel and Ebert reviews of films that I'm assuming you've seen, and then you get to pick the film, or guess the film, I should say, that they're reviewing. How does that sound?
The pressure is building, and I've been such a great test taker in school. This is going to be awful, but it's going to be fun. So I can't wait for this, but I am disappointed at the Captain Ron conversation that we'll have to come up with something later down the road, because that one would be a good discussion.
I mean, maybe we can do it on the Cult-Worthy for something. We have to find a reason
to
get Captain Ron into the conversation. Maybe pair it with Pure Luck, because that's another guilty pleasure of mine too. I don't know. We'll see how that goes. And I was thinking that if this goes well, we could flip the tables sometime, and then you could do a quiz on me. Because for some reason, I always seem to be like the quiz giver and not the taker. And I like to play too sometimes, right? I don't want to be the professor all the time, so... All right. I think we should go ahead and get this going. Now, I think these are going to be pretty easy for you, but I could be wrong, and we could have an interesting conversation of how you didn't get it. So to start off the game show, we have this first review from the 1990s. You ready?
All set. Let's do it.
Boy, I feel just about the same way. Every time I see a David Lynch picture, I think to myself, this guy is so gifted that if he would only just break down and make a movie instead of being so clever all the time and trying to outsmart himself with basically what are sophomoric little plot devices, stuff that
it would be very hard to make this convincing.
It doesn't pay off. It doesn't have a purpose. It seems contrived. It seems frustrating, and not to an end.
No, it just lays there, and I don't know if anybody could make heads or tails of this material.
Ready?
First one, and I'm already stumped. Not Blue Velvet. 1990s. Wild Heart.
Wow. That was Lost Highway.
Oh, crap.
Infamously known for getting 2 thumbs down from Siskel and Ebert. So brilliantly put on the poster for the movie.
2 thumbs down.
That they advertise it as 2 thumbs down.
This is not going well so far. Oh, man.
Well, that's what they say. If you can get the first one wrong, it means that you're going to be doing the rest of them pretty right. So here we go with number 2.
Well, I won't hate you for it, Gene, because my thumb is not even marginally down, and I'll tell you why. First of all, I didn't even go for the Brenda Fricker scenes because I thought that they went on way too long, were overwritten and treacly and sentimental and shameless in the way that the little twerp kind of lectures her on the meaning of life and the meaning of truth, and she's so grateful to find out these words of wisdom from his angelic little mouth. The violence, which is obviously, you're quite right, modeled on all those cartoons with the Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote. They use the wide-angle lens to make it seem that things are really coming from a long way down and slamming on top of everyone. is really tough stuff. Usually live action versions of cartoons don't work because when flesh and blood is involved, it's not that funny.
I do think that this kid is a big talent.
I got it. So it has to be Home Alone 2 Lost in New York, because this one, yes. This one, I think the first one went in a little bit of direction. It was too unique, but at the same time, when we're seeing the same repetitive formula coming from it, and this is one that they're following their critique of the same formula. And I remember the Roadrunner, and that's what really made me question on which one between the first and the second one that really almost threw me off.
And I'd never seen the review for Home Alone 2 before. And I think that everyone agrees that Home Alone 2 is the less superior of the two Home Alone films with Macaulay Culkin. It does have its moments. It was definitely sequel-itis, like we've talked about. But yeah, I agree 100% with what Roger was saying about the Brenda Fricker scenes, where it's like, okay, this is a time-worn old woman living in Central Park, and Macaulay Culkin is going to like lecture her on life and what it means. And she's going to be like, yes, I never thought of it that way. Yeah, it's got real, just sentimentally over sappily sweet John Hughes overtones to it. And it's like my biggest issue with that movie is all the Brenda Fricker stuff. And it's not her fault. She's great. It's just weird.
It is weird, but at the same time, it does what it needs to do, is to shed a slight tear at the end. We saw them in the first one. It would be absent if we didn't have it in the second one. It's repetitive, but at the time, it's effective, but weird.
Definitely weird. Okay, I knew that you're going to get that one. All right, here we go with the next clip.
Every once in a while, a critic is forced to go back and reevaluate his track record.
Yeah.
And after seeing
Oh, I know what you're going to say.
and Jerky Boys, Dumb and Dumber is beginning to look more and more like Citizen Kane to me.
Well, Dumb and Dumber is a good picture.
I should have rated Dumb
Yes.
and Dumber a little higher to have more room underneath to shove these other pictures in. Adam Sandler has a problem, and that is he's not an attractive screen presence.
No,
he might have a future as a villain or as a fall guy or the butt of a joke, but as the protagonist, his problem is that he recreates the fingernails on the blackboard syndrome.
Kind
You
of
can't
obnoxious.
stand him.
Yeah, he's obnoxious.
Yeah.
And really, you don't have a good motivation for the character's behavior. They didn't even get to that level in the writing at all.
Oh, God. This defines every Adam Sandler movie. But I'm going to take a shot at Big Daddy.
Wow. This was the review for Billy Madison from 1995. And I think what the giveaway for that is they said Jerky Boys, which came out the same year. Between that and Billy Madison, they think that by comparison, it made Dumb and Dumber look like a masterpiece. And Gene notoriously kind of liked Dumb and Dumber, so I think that's an interesting conversation right there. I didn't put it in the clip, but towards the end of that review, Roger specifically said that he didn't think that Adam Sandler was going to have much of a career. Maybe if he tried like a villainous role, but he didn't see much of a future for him. And that just goes to show, in hindsight, that these guys weren't always right, and that sometimes, I don't know, majority rules. And even though it's a dumb movie, a bad movie by a critic's standpoint, there's just something about certain actors and what they bring to the screen that just remains iconic and creates a loyal fan base. I think that's why they hated those guys so much, is because they could not stand the idea that rubber-faced actors like Jim Carrey back in his early day, Adam Sandler, for better or worse, Rob Schneider movies could ever gain a financial following where people are going to pay money to go see these movies. And it infuriated them. And I also think that's why that like they would be more vocal when they had their critiques, because it was like against everything they stood for cinematically.
At the given time of the review, you take, like you said, Jim Carrey, Adam Sandler. These are the ones that are so silly given their first movies that are released that they say, this is too silly to take this guy seriously. There's no way And both, even Jim Carrey and Adam Sandler, they go on to make The Truman Show and Uncut Gems, and they just take audiences by surprise on how good they can be when it comes to a serious role. And we've had that conversation before, that transitioning from a character from silliness to seriousness, the most tragic personalities of comedy are the ones that usually have to feel trauma before you can feel comedy. So the transition between the two are spot on. And it shocks me even back then that critics didn't see through that, to see the potential of silliness being a forte on a range that can go completely out there to a dramatic role.
Excellent point, because one of the things I was thinking about the 90s compared to the other 2 decades before that, these guys kind of like started becoming more relevant in the world of TV and print film criticism, is that in the 70s and 80s, we did not really have character comedic sketch actors like these guys having their own movies and their own vehicles. You'd get offshoots every once in a while. Like, let's say Bobcat Goldthwait would be in a movie, right? And it would just kind of be garbage in most people's eyes, and they wouldn't make money. The 90s is what changed that. The 90s is when all of a sudden you did have a cult following for a TV personality, whether it was a sitcom or a sketch show like Saturday Night Live, and then that audience would follow them to the cinema. Hence, your Tommy Boys, your Billy Madisons, right? That was, I think, the high watermark of the 90s comedies. And just like every decade that we've noticed, it takes them a while to catch on. It takes them a while to recognize what these people actually mean in cinema. But it also brings me to another point. We've seen both Gene and Roger defend children's films and films for children and family audiences, whether or not they were great, but they were good entertainment, right? We never really saw them defend teenagers. We never really saw them defend late adolescents and films for them. It's like it was too close to adult cinema or mature cinema, but too far removed from kids cinema. They never really jumped onto that bandwagon. I'm going to say the entire run of their show and their careers. And I think that's a travesty, because if they would have just taken that moment to think of an adolescent's mindset and what entertains an adolescent rather than a child or someone in their 20s and above, I think they would have had a different viewpoint on how these films actually played and what they meant in the realm of cinema.
I think there's a fine line between what kids entertainment is and what adult entertainment is, and teenagers evolve more quickly over art than anything. Hollywood targets the teenage audience because that's their ticket out of the house. Those are the butts that are in the seat. So I think this is one that Gene and Roger really had hard time, along with many critics, on how they're going to identify or relate to the movies coming out that is targeting teenagers. You have the slashers, you have the gross out comedies that most teenagers would just say, this is taboo, let's go see it.
Right.
So I think it is hard for Hollywood and critics to adjust to the teenage audience and actually understand it. Critics had the hardest when it comes to that because it's pretty cut and dry with animation, family movies, and then R-rated movies. But teenagers now and will always be kind of that question mark, because even we reflect to when we were teenagers, looking at movies now targeted for teenagers, I'm like, WTF, what is this garbage? And I'm feeling crotchety that I'm kind of looking at this movie, not how I would see it as a teenager. So I think it's one of those, if you can make a perfect teenage movie that's both teenage and adult and make it work, I think that would be a miracle, because I have a better chance of winning the lottery than having a movie that appeases critics and teenagers alike.
I think it might be a cool experiment to really kind of look into their reviews of 1984 and 1985 when the PG-13 rating came out, and how they actually were having to adjust their criticism of, is this a movie for a mature audience, or is this something that you do take your kids to? Because that was a really interesting time where now all of a sudden we are creating a rating for movies that aren't quite R, but too heavy for PG. I mean, we've talked about it before. The Beastmaster is PG, and it's got full frontal nudity several times and gore. So it's going to be an interesting conversation when we delve into movies from that era, because I love seeing that period where they're trying to temper themselves in the time. They're trying to temper themselves in the decade, and it takes them a couple years to finally reach a point where they can give a real relevant critique on a film, but they're just a little bit behind the social norm.
Problem solved. Take out the PG-13 rating. Let's have full frontal nudity on PG. Everybody's happy. So I'm totally for that.
Dude, as long as we're getting rid of stuff in this country, let's get rid of PG-13, right? Let's just go back to the old ways, the good old days of Hollywood, where we have PG movies and R movies, and whatever is in between just gets filtered into one or the other.
Part of the best jobs as a parent is to roll the dice and cross your fingers, hoping we don't see full frontal nudity in a PG movie. If you come out with your kids smiling with no nudity, that's a win in a family environment.
Agreed. All right, let's see if you get the next one.
I like the film a lot. I loved the play. This is one of my favorite plays. And I think there are times when I heard the words and the action seemed a little stagey for me. But at the same time, at the end of this, I was so wired up that I took some notes. And one of the things I wrote down as I walked out of this movie is, if a salesman were to call me in the next hour, I would have picked up the phone and shouted an obscenity into the phone and slammed it down at them, because I was so pumped up.
Do you even need the quiz music?
No, it's one of my dialogue-driven favorites, and Jack Lemmon personal favorite, and that's Glengarry Glen Ross.
I mean, and Roger goes off for like 2 minutes about how much he loves Jack Lemmon's performance in that film. And that's a review I just remembered off the top of my head, where he just kind of goes, almost repeats the dialogue play by play of when Jack Lemmon shows up at the dude's house and tries to sell him real estate in the middle of the night when it's raining outside with the little comfy pillows on his lap.
It is a classic, and it reminds me of the remake of 12 Angry Men that still held its own on just quality performances. This is one of those movies that I can watch over and over and over again and pick up something new on delivery, pick up something new on the character relationships, the stresses. This is something that I think needs to be revisited. If you haven't seen it, it's one of my all-time go-tos when it comes to how to interact with almost a one-set ensemble of characters and dialogue, and really crescendo the chemistry and the tension without anything else added to the set. So it's a brilliant film.
You know, I think about this all the time. I absolutely loved James Foley's direction of that movie. I thought it was amazing. And I thought back when that came out that James Foley was going to be like a director that was going to just make hit after hit after hit after hit. And that wasn't really the case. Like he didn't really make anything to live up to Glengarry Glen Ross, in my opinion. And the fact that he made, like, I think it was like the second or the third 50 Shades movie. And I was like, wow, like what happened, bro? But I guess maybe that is what happens when you peak early, man. Like Glengarry Glen Ross is a masterclass of not only dialogue, but performance and direction. It's really sad because I really loved what he did with that movie, and it just never did anything close to what that was. I got a bonus question for you since you're the theater guy. Who originated the role of Ricky Roma in the Broadway production of Glengarry Glen Ross?
Tell me, I don't know.
It was Joe Mantegna, bro. David Mamet, you should have guessed that one.
I should.
If it's David Mamet, it's going to be William H. Macy or Joe Mantegna, hands down.
It's like thrown off on a theater question. I should have nailed that one.
If it was a musical, you would have gotten it.
That's true.
All right, here comes the next one.
The thing about that scene is that they obviously think they're funny there.
And
you know,
they are not.
Basically, one of the rules of comedy, which both of these guys know in other movies, is you never act as if you think you're funny, because then it isn't funny. You always have to act as if you don't know you're funny.
Right.
Maybe they'll remember that their next time around with the comedy. Maybe the failure of provides an excuse to talk about the whole mystery of chemistry in the movies. Why people like and Warren can make great comedies on their own, and yet the combination this time of these two of them with writer-director Elaine May, whose own movie A New Leaf is a hilarious
Right.
This combination just didn't work.
Okay, 1980s. two famous movie stars whose name I bleeped out in a comedy where they say they have no chemistry, and it was a colossal failure at the box office.
1980s.
And I gave you a really big hint. I left the writer and director of the film in the clip.
I know. I'm going through my registry here.
Post 1985.
Oh my God. Is this going to be one I kick my ass over too?
I think you're going to kick your ass on all of these.
I think I am. It's the comedy ones that are driving me crazy here. Okay. Crap. I don't know. Tell me.
I'll give you the stars. The stars were Warren Beatty and Dustin Hoffman. And the film was Ishtar, written and directed by Elaine May.
Oh,
Again,
that was an awful movie.
And this is from the Worst of 1987 episode as well. I grabbed two of them.
That's right. Okay, in fairness, that movie, one, forgettable, and two, it's one that you just kind of turn your brain off and don't pay attention to. I debate that one.
And it's a movie that has its offenders because it's actually been on the Cult Worthy before. And my co-host of that episode and I defended it because I personally love that movie. But I love it for all the reasons why you, a critic, would hate it. This got made. Someone financed this. Someone paid like $1 million a day to cater to Warren Beatty's and Dustin Hoffman's need out in the middle of the desert. They would fly them in and out from LA to the desert every week to shoot. Yeah, it's notorious for excess, but I can't help but love it. And Paul Williams did the music.
In fairness, if you're a fan of Warren Beatty, I can see it. I can see the appeal to it, but not a good movie. That's another debate, I'm sure.
Hey, you know what? Critics of the day would agree with you, and defenders like me would debate that. All right, here we go.
That evil corrupts everyone who comes into contact with it. The scariest element of the film for me is perverse charm as he persecutes this family. He is sadistic, he is evil, but like a wounded animal that cannot help its violent nature, he kind of gets under our skin. And it's also frightening the way the daughter seems seduced by the darkest and most satanic elements in her environment. She has a smile that's the most disturbing thing in the film.
1992.
My first instinct is Man's Best Friend, but that doesn't make sense.
Seduced by Evil.
Poltergeist 2? 3?
I love that you're going with horror. Let me give you one more.
Up.
Let me give you one more hint. It is not technically a horror film, and it is directed by a man who normally does or is known for his mob movies.
I think your hint just made it harder. Mob movies, not a horror.
Give up.
It's going to make no sense. Hand That Rocks the Cradle, The Good Son, but it makes no sense. What is it?
Oh my gosh, you are so close in the terms of the thriller aspect. It is Cape Fear, directed by Martin Scorsese, starring Juliette Lewis and Robert De Niro, and that's who he's talking about specifically. De Niro was the name that I blocked out.
The little girl aspect threw me off because I don't view it that way.
She's
in the
a
film.
teenager, but again, she's like 15, and there is a seduction scene. So yeah. I can't wait till you play this game with me because I'm probably going to do the exact same thing that you're doing right now. I'm going to be like,
Okay, hands down, that's the question that's going to make me kick my ass the rest of the night because that one threw me off. That was harder than your first question. Yeah.
All right. We continue.
I thought this movie was smart. I thought it was brainy. I thought it was fascinating. There were two things about it that I didn't like so much, but it didn't involve Julia. How can you attack Julia Roberts for having been familiar because she's in Pretty Woman? What about Kiefer Sutherland? What about Kevin Bacon?
I thought
this movie has movie stars in it.
That's right.
Every movie we see has movie stars in it. Are you going to say she should have never made another movie?
No. I thought you might bring that up, and that's why I want to say
that these guys, who are also familiar for me, seem to be played down. And maybe the way they're photographed is played down. Here she seemed to be photographed as beauteous object, whereas these guys, who could be good-looking and appealing to other people.
You have a hard time photographing her in any other way. She's a good-looking woman, and I don't hold that against her in this movie.
So that's the very last one of the game. 1990.
19. Kiefer. The Flatliners.
Flatliners.
God. Oh, yeah.
You knew what you were talking about.
God. Thank God, at least I got that one right.
It makes your heart seize up, right?
It does. It's like you're trying to connect the dots and listen to the critique at the same time. This is a true new game of brain teasers,
dude,
because it's insane.
We invented like a new game, at least for us, because the thing about most movie trivia is like, if you told me what 1995 film starred so-and-so and so-and-so, I got it, right? But to have to try and figure it out from a critique, especially when I bleeped out a lot of the names, that's what makes it challenging. So this was a test run to see like how well we know A, our movies, and B, how we know Siskel and Ebert's critiques and reviews. Because like I said, I put in movies that I was almost positive you've seen. I wasn't going to put any kind of obscure thing. Could you imagine if it was a movie that neither of us had seen, how we would guess it? So I think we found one more tool to put in our toolbox of sharpening the knowledge block of Siskel and Ebert and film.
I had to convince myself before we actually hopped on that you were going to put in your Antonio films that there is no way I was going to get. And I think I saw that through here. I'm overthinking what Antonio's going to do and listening to the review and listening to some of the cast. And it's a complete brain twister. I absolutely loved it.
It's psychological warfare because I almost was guaranteed that you were going to think that I was going to try and do some like weird flippy shit on you. That I was going to put like obscure horror movies or like cult B movie musicals that you haven't seen, but I have. No. I was going to say, okay, I'm going to actually pick movies that are pretty iconic for their decade. Home Alone 2 was kind of a gimme, right? That's what I was going to try and do. I wasn't going to try and make it hard, but it's still pretty hard if you're just going by the critique and not having all of like the information at hand, the directors, the actors, the year, the genre. So yeah, this was a lot of fun. I hope you put a good list together for me because I can't wait to play this game on my end.
I am going to have to up it a little bit because I know you've probably seen more movies than I have. And I think when we go into it, the reviews are going to be a big piece of connecting the dots, but it's a good testament to how we actually know our critics too, because it twisted me a little bit, especially when it comes to the horror versus thriller that I have, because their reviews come across almost the same different way on what the characters are portraying themselves and how they kind of interact with the audience. So we kind of see some similarities to kind of the horror and thriller aspect of it that it's hard to kind of tear apart what they're actually wanting from a movie. So I think there's a lot to this game that's a little bit more deeper than I anticipated.
Well, and while I was putting this list together, it made me think of something else. And I don't want to sound pretentious at all, so don't take it this way. Do you think, and this is me just kind of being, I don't know, hyperbolic a little bit. I think when you are a career critic like they are, and I'm not saying that you're not a career critic, you definitely think with a critical mind, where I have the appreciation aspect and the exposure aspect, right? Is it easier to kind of like flush the data as a critic once you've written your piece? Because you're always like creating new critiques and new ways to communicate your expression of the film, your idea of the film, what do you think it means, and then you're on to the next, and then you're on to the next. I feel that these guys did not retain the knowledge and the data of the films they were reviewing because they had to review so many, and they had to like have critical thinking and what their words are going to be, that once they were done, especially if it was a film that was not love it or hate it, but in the middle, those would kind of just get wiped from the memory banks, where people like me who literally just like collect movies in their brain like people collect Pokemon cards, we are going to like stick to the data. we're going to maintain the idea of like, oh, this wacky director directed this movie and this movie and this movie, which starred this guy who was with this girl and she was nude in this movie. Like, I feel like we have different synapses than people who are critical about movies do. Would you agree, or would you debate that?
No, I wouldn't debate it at all, because there's a level of accuracy there. Because, going on my show, going on to the 4th season, you doing 3 to 4 movies a week, and you're seeing multiple movies and genres throughout the year. There is a level of unintentional complacency where you're describing a movie and you just kind of are familiar with the words that are being flushed onto a piece of paper or a computer screen. And you're just like, I've said this before, or I've vocalized this before. And that's where a critic really has to decide, is the movie worth changing and doing the work to change the vision of what you want to paint for the reader or the listener or whatever it may be. And we see that in Gene and Roger, even to an extent. The difference between the two is Roger is a little bit more articulate when it comes to adding some personal touches to it on how he felt during the movie. But there are different aspects of the review process that we see, that we saw even in that I had openly admit in these questions, that it feels familiar. And as we do this show, we're going to have those reviews. We already have, that do feel familiar or repetitive. So it's hard for anybody, whether you're a professional receiving a paycheck for the review or just an amateur like myself, to not go down that rabbit hole of just complacency of, well, this movie is just like the movie I saw last week in this genre, so I'm just going to take that paragraph and copy and paste it there. So there has to be some difference and separation, because movies deserve it and the audience deserves it. Readers deserve it. So I think that is kind of what we see in Roger and Siskel and Ebert at this point, is they've seen movies for 30 plus years I think at this point, that it's hard to get past that and not feel I've already said it.
Takes me back to, I think it was when they were on the Howard Stern episode, and Gene was like kind of bragging how he had written a book, or sorry, Roger was bragging about how he had written a book and Gene hadn't. And Howard started like reading passages from Roger's book, and Roger couldn't remember the films that he was talking about. That's my point, is I feel like there is something to the idea that like you are literally just expunging data. And once it's on the page, it kind of leaves the brain. And there's nothing wrong with that, but I agree. I mean, I bet you would have a hard time remembering what movies you saw in like your first 3 episodes. Like,
no, I agree. Hell, I have problems remembering last month, depending on the movie. But does that mean you hate loving the movie or you hate going to the experience? No, but it's talking about it, especially if there's no appeal or effort or of interest that you're being presented with. It's hard to kind of put that effort into the critique when you're not seeing it being reciprocated or given back to the audience. So I think I can understand, but I'm not going to judge a critic for kind of the repetitiveness or the effort going into it, because I understand it. But in no way does it show a distrust to the audience or distrust to the movie or the filmmakers. It's just, where do I go with this movie? There are movies even I stare at the computer screen for a half hour for a mere 2 sentences on how I'm going to describe what this movie is about or how I feel about it. And at times, I just say, it's a generic movie. It's getting 1.5 stars. It's getting 1 star. I'm going to plop something on there because I'm not going to spend another hour of my time after an hour and a half watching the movie just having a description of 2 sentences of something I didn't like.
Agreed. No, I think this was a really great exercise in both, the knowledge we keep, but also just like how we overthink things, especially with film. I think your biggest detriment is you are overthinking every review and every critique. And I'm really, really excited to see what I'm going to do when we play this game on my side. So yeah, everyone, thanks for joining us in this experiment, this little game. I think we should have more games on the show. Like this was fun. I'm really excited about this new concept that we can bring in every once in a while. So this is the last episode of February, and we're jumping into March. And like we announced a little bit earlier in the season, that March was going to be the month of musicals, Musical March. And we all know how I am not necessarily a fan of musicals. We know that Justin is. So we are bringing 2 musicals that Roger and Jean reviewed on their show. And we're going to start with mine. So the first week of March is going to be 1979's Hair, directed by Milos Forman, starring Treat Williams and John Savage and Beverly D'Angelo. And it's a film that I do like, but I have not watched the critique of Siskel and Ebert, so that'll be exciting. And then we'll move on to Justin's and back and forth and so on.
I think March is not only my most anticipated month of the year, and I'll tell the future, and of this season. I'm excited for Musical March, and I think based on kind of your picks, we're going to have some contrast to the kind of musicals that we're bringing to the table. But mine are legendary, and you can't convince me otherwise.
Agreed. And I know which at least one of yours are, and I have not watched the critiques of any of these yet. So I'm really excited to see what they have to say about these movies and how close they are to, my personal critique of them. One of them I haven't watched in at least a decade. It's been on my shelf and I just haven't watched it. I think it's my mom's and I just inherited it. So that's the one I'll be bringing on my second pick. But Hair is a film I've always loved. I'm a huge Milos Forman fan, and I'm a huge Treat Williams fan. And this is the kind of musical that I kind of dig, where it's not theatrical. It's a nice, realistic approach to a theatrical musical without feeling too stagey. And that's why I like it. I'll get more into that when we actually do the episode.
You love musicals so much, you go for the subtle musical. Got it.
The subtle musical, absolutely. All right, everyone. Thank you for listening, watching, playing along, and we'll play this game again very soon. So you can always find me, Antonio, over at The Cult Worthy. Listen to my show on all listening platforms. Find it on YouTube or at thecultworthy.com. And then you can find my co-host Justin's stuff over at
themoviewire.com.
And keep sending in those listener requests. We have a bunch of them, but we're going to put them on pause so we can actually do some real stuff that we are picking. Like I said, we wanted to do the shows that we hadn't seen before, the movies we haven't seen, and we could do listener requests all year. And twice now we've been burned because we've had 2 listener requests that they did not cover on either of their shows on Siskel and Ebert or at the movies. So we have to do a little bit more diligence when people send listener requests.
We should put just in small print, make sure that they reviewed the movie, but we'll do the work for you.
Yeah, but it was still fun to revisit the movies that we ended up not finding reviews for because I hadn't watched them in ages.
I watched Captain Ron twice this week, so no complaints here.
I might watch it again. I love Captain Ron. All right, everyone, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next week.
See you next week.